In an endless sea of Dragon Ball content, let's take a moment to get to know the man behind the work. This is Akira Toriyama, author of Dragon Ball, a father of two, and to many of us, a superhero. It's no secret that Akira Toriyama was a hikikomori, or a shut-in. He's been quoted saying, "When I look at it, I don't really like people and socializing is really awful. Outside of my family, friends, and those connected to my job, I don't think I actively want to meet anyone." But contrary to what many may believe, he's done quite a few interviews where he divulges plenty about himself. I've gathered most of those interviews here, going over who he was in life and what kind of struggles he endured. So if you were ever curious how he got his start as a manga artist and the kind of life he had before, in between, and after, then join me on this episode of Culture Explained, where we take a look into the lives of artists and creators. Son of Karasu and Tobi Toriyama, and older brother of Uzuro Toriyama, Akira Toriyama was born on April 5, 1955 in Nagoya and raised in Kiyosu, a rural suburb just outside the city of Nagoya in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. The first source of inspiration that made young Akira want to get serious about drawing was watching Disney's 101 Dalmatians in kindergarten. He remembers being blown away by the drawings and hoped to someday be skilled enough to draw just like that. He and his childhood friends would sometimes visit this nearby art studio called Zugaya-san Art Studio, where he'd win a prize for doing a 101 Dalmatians illustration. This would serve as one of the earliest forms of encouragement for the young artist. One day, he'd go over to a classmate's house and her older brother had a collection of comics. These were Japanese comics called manga, and this was his first exposure to them. He'd fall in love with the manga art style and started to draw it himself. Soon thereafter, he'd experience television for the first time at a neighbor's house, where he'd be exposed to Osamu Tezuka's Mighty Atom, or Astro Boy as we know it. He grew up watching a lot of shows just like this in his youth. These simple and lighthearted cartoons are what set the tone for his later work. As a young boy, Toriyama said he was quite mischievous. He'd play outside all day until it got dark, and then spent the rest of his time drawing pictures of animals and vehicles that he liked. He was a big animal lover, watching animal shows and owning nearly 100 birds, such as a crow and a Java sparrow. Pretty fitting considering Tori is Japanese for bird. Although he owned birds, his favorite kind of animal was amphibians, followed by dogs and cats. However, he did hate rodents like mice, thinking they were filthy. Anyway, Akira's enjoyment of drawing came with an odd habit. Since his family was poor, when he wanted something, he drew it over and over, drawing it over 100 times. First, he remembered drawing horses, which was the first drawing he was proud of. He got everything down to the joints correct. But soon he realized a horse was unrealistic, so he drew chimpanzees. But after going to the Nagoya Zoo and seeing how ugly their butts were, he changed his mind to a bike. All this drawing was good practice for him. This is how he'd eventually surpass his classmates. He was always learning by observing the world around him. While his friends were all stuck copying manga, Toriyama was already drawing caricatures of his classmates. This is when he started realizing how fun drawing was. Surprisingly, in these early days, Toriyama was quite the student, maintaining good grades and holding positions like class rep and student council president. Since his textbooks were always full of doodles, it was known he liked to draw. As president, he'd be tasked to create school posters and such, which was kind of a downside for him. Around the 4th grade, Akira transitioned from kids shows to live action shows like tokusatsu, a genre of costumed superheroes and special effects like Ultraman and Kamen Rider. He also watched samurai and monster movies like Godzilla. When junior high rolled around, his grades began slipping and he'd become remarkably quiet. His love for movies though only grew, often riding his bike to the Nagoya Theater to see the latest monster film. One time he even used his position as student council president to sway the vote of which movie would be shown in the gymnasium. The movie he chose? Well, it was a monster movie called Invasion of Astro Monster. Admittedly, Toriyama wasn't into manga. He stopped reading for the most part around this time, even though all his classmates were getting into it. Before leaving junior high, at 14, Toriyama purchased a wooden pen holder, something that holds pen tips and ink. This will become very important for him later. When it came time for high school, Toriyama opted for the design-oriented Okoshi Technical School, where he'd study graphic design. At this age, he was just a teenager who was more interested in fun, often hitting up places like toy stores, ramen shops, and bowling alleys after school. He also started to draw less, with his interests changing. His appreciation of manga would still be present as he was the president of the manga club, but he wasn't really a manga reader. In spite of this, he would still draw manga, but would never finish any of them. With graduation approaching, he decided he had enough of studying, so he chose to go straight into the workforce despite his parents' wishes for him to attend college. Having studied design, at around 18 or 19, he started working at an advertising agency in Nagoya, designing things like posters and flyers for supermarkets and big retailers that said things like year-end bargains or super sale on now, etc. He He caught on quickly and claimed to be one of the more talented ones there, but the work was draining, having to meet deadlines and do things like draw 100 pairs of socks, and lettering, which he said he wasn't good at. On top of the work itself, there were also certain expectations which Toriyama couldn't follow. He'd get in quite some trouble for not dressing properly and was often late since he'd be up all night building plastic model kits, or sometimes from working late at the office, not coming home until about 2 or 3 a.m. Not being a morning person cost him a lot. 3 tardies counted as a full absence, and his bonuses were considerably smaller than others. But little did he know that things like meeting deadlines and lettering would be pivotal in the next steps of his life. He stayed at this job for about 2.5 to 3 years until he left for greener pastures. Actually, he wouldn't do much of anything for about a year, and his parents were embarrassed. He spent a lot of time hitting up cafes and looking at comics, but there obviously came a time where he needed money for things like life expenses, fun, and cigarettes. Yeah, he was a heavy smoker. For a period, he had actually been asking his mother for cigarette and cafe money. On one of these trips to a cafe, he came across a copy of Kodansha's weekly shonen magazine, advertising an amateur manga contest with a winning prize of 500,000 yen, or $2,000 to $2,500 at that time. He decided to enter, and on his 22nd birthday started drawing what would be his first ever manga. However, the magazine's competition deadline came and flew by, and the next one wouldn't be for 6 months. This led Toriyama to seek another similar competition, where he came across Shonen Jump and its competition, the monthly Young Jump Award. The prize money for this magazine was significantly less, only 100,000 yen, or $400 to $500. But the fact that it was monthly was the deciding factor for him, as he could try again and again month after month. For his first entry, he'd sent in Owawa World. Now, before we move on, I need to clarify something. Toriyama adamantly claimed he was 23 when he created Owawa World, but earlier I said he was 22. But sources say it was created in 77, making him 22. So choose whichever you want to believe. Unfortunately, this first entry was not received well, and it was never officially published, with only his name being credited in the magazine. Later this same year, something massive came to theaters. Star Wars. Toriyama was really into American movies and pop culture, and he paid tribute to it in his work, like Owawa World that had a Superman-like character in it. So of course Star Wars needed to make its way into his work as well. He was stubborn and wanted that prize money, so he got to work on his next creation, which was Mysterious Rain Jack. This manga clearly parodied Star Wars, and although it made it far in the competition, it was ultimately disqualified, due to it being based on another work, making it difficult to publish. However, a second-year editor at Jump by the name of Kazuhiko Torishima read this entry and was very impressed by the impact of the sound effects and the way they were written. So from what I understood, Toriyama opted to use the Japanese alphabet of hiragana, which is used for everyday Japanese, but the standard for comics was katakana, which is used for foreign languages. If I'm wrong, someone please correct me. This odd choice in lettering likely came from the fact that Toriyama didn't really read manga, so he was pretty unfamiliar with the standard practices, but Torishima thought it was refreshing and decided to give the young amateur a call. He told Akira that he was still in rough shape, but encouraged him to keep drawing and to send manga directly his way. Up until this point, Toriyama's parents had been telling him how he's just been goofing off, but now he finally had something to show for his endeavors. Except for the prize money, he still wanted that. It's worth noting that, much like Toriyama, Torishima didn't have much experience with manga either, originally getting a job at Shueisha to work as an editor on Monthly Playboy. By the way, Shueisha is the largest publishing company in Japan, which magazines like Shonen Jump are published under. Maybe it was the fact that both men weren't well versed in manga that brought them together, but either way, I'm glad they found each other. Before being published, Toriyama went through 500 pages worth of ideas. He had no idea how to create manga, so Torishima had to whip him into shape. While these 500 pages were rejected, they wouldn't go to waste, as he'd refer back to these in the future for ideas. Akira Toriyama would make his official Shonen Jump debut late 1978 with Wonder Island. The story follows a pilot who crash lands in the Pacific where he finds himself on Wonder Island. The manga would flop, finishing dead last in the reader survey polls. Shortly after, he'd release Wonder Island 2, which had little to do with the first part other than it being on Wonder Island. This second manga would also do poorly, and Toriyama came close to just quitting once he got paid for his work. But thankfully his stubbornness and pride made him keep going, which gave us his next one-shot called Today's Highlight Island. By the way, a one-shot is just what it sounds like, it's a one-chapter manga. This story would do slightly better in the reader rankings, but still not good enough. Toriyama was busy cooking up his next manga, Dr. Slump, a story centered around scientist Senbei Norimaki and his crazy inventions. The first chapter had a cute little robot girl named Orale, which was one of his creations. Torishima thought she was great, but was confused when she wasn't in the storyboard for the second chapter. Toriyama explained that she was only one invention meant for one chapter. This was his idea to have a new weekly invention. Torishima advised him to make Orale the star of the show, to which he refused, saying it was a boys' comic and boys wanted manliness. The two men made a bet. Toriyama was to produce a one-shot with a female lead, and if it ranked at least 3rd place, he'd have to make Orale the lead of Dr. Slump. The one-shot he'd come up with was Tomato the Cutesy Gumshoe, and wouldn't you know, it placed 3rd. Although Torishima won the bet, Toriyama didn't budge on renaming the manga. Dr. Slump began its serialization on February 4th, 1980. In its first week, Jump bundled the first 2 chapters of Slump without any notice, which came as a shock as now they were a week behind. But something amazing happened. Dr. Slump placed 2nd in the reader rankings in that first week. In the beginning, Torishima said that if Dr. Slump wasn't popular, then it could end after 10 chapters, which sounded good to Toriyama. However, by the time the 3rd chapter was published, Dr. Slump had made its way to the #1 spot, meaning this manga was in it for the long run. This would be the manga to launch Toriyama into complete stardom, making the name Akira Toriyama known in the industry. And although the success was nice, the workload was anything but. Although Akira did eventually get an assistant, Hisashi Tanaka, he didn't have one when Dr. Slump began, meaning he'd have to sketch, draw, and ink everything by himself with his trusty G-pen from Zebra and his wooden pen holder. These would be his tools of choice for the majority of his manga career. Keeping up week after week was rough. There was a time when Toriyama said he only got 20 minutes of sleep for 6 days. Creating new weekly gag material was also no easy feat, as he began running out of ideas, which would force him to make the manga more story-driven. On top of all this, he still lived in Kiyosu with his parents, and all the people he worked with were in Tokyo, hundreds of miles away. This was of course his decision, as he hated the crowds of Tokyo. But since he didn't have a fax machine, this came with the added challenge of mailing his work to his editor. He'd have to drive early in the morning to the airport against the blinding sun to mail his storyboards and manuscripts. After just 6 months, Toriyama was ready for the manga to end, but as with anything successful, the ones at the top want more, and they got more. Dr. Slump went on to win the 27th Shogakukan Manga Award for Best Boy and Girl Manga less than a year after it began. It would also receive an anime adaptation, Dr. Slump and Orale-chan, which aired on April 8, 1981, 7 p.m. primetime Wednesdays on Fuji TV. The anime began just 14 months after the start of the manga, which was an unprecedented accomplishment for such a new author. Ratings were very good, averaging about 15 to 24%, with one episode still holding the #3 spot for the highest rated anime broadcast of all time, according to Anime News Network. However, Torishima wouldn't like the anime because it strayed far away from the manga. He said it was the first real time the Weekly Shonen Jump team had to manage an anime based on one of their manga, and the management was all over the place. Up until this point, Jump hadn't taken anime productions too seriously since manga was still more profitable. But Torishima changed this once Dr. Slump proved that anime adaptations had potential. Just to mention it, since some of you might find this interesting, at the end of 1980 would be the first appearance of Toribot as we know him today. However, he'd show up before as a bird, playing off Tori meaning bird. This is Akira Toriyama himself in a gas mask because he thought it embarrassing to use his real face, even though he would still do that in Dr. Slump. While we as fans have dubbed this Toribot, Toriyama did name him Robo Toriyama. Anyway, back to Slump. For us here in the West, the impact of Dr. Slump may seem minuscule compared to what would eventually come. But in reality, this was it. This is what made Akira Toriyama famous and into a multi-millionaire. It's reported that in 1979, before Dr. Slump, Akira had a monthly salary of about $126. And the following year, in 1980, the year Dr. Slump began, he made nearly $224,000. And then guess what that jumped to? 1 year into Slump, his earnings in 1981 increased tenfold to nearly $2.3 million. Millions of copies were selling and nearly 1,000 different pieces of merchandise were being sold. Toriyama actually had to rent another home just to fit all the Dr. Slump product samples being sent his way. Before we continue, we have to discuss another important life event that happened at this time. As we discussed, Toriyama lived in Kiyosu and the world of manga was in Tokyo, making it difficult for him to make any friends in his field. He'd reach out to a fellow manga writer who lived in his town and they planned a dinner to which a few other manga artists would be invited to. In the intro to Dr. Slump chapter 64, he outlines this dinner, naming several manga artists that attended. He mentions his assistant by his pseudonym Hiswashi, who ended up doing his own manga. He'd stop being Toriyama's full-time assistant because of this 2 years later in 1983. But the more important name to pay attention to is Nachi Mikami, which is the pen name of Yoshimi Kato. It's said that it was her relative that Toriyama reached out to. Unfortunately, I'm not sure which of these artists is the relative, but nevertheless, Yoshimi was invited as she lived nearby. I also read that they went to high school together, but I'm not sure how true that is. The information regarding exactly how they met is sparse, but this dinner was their big meeting. Both Toriyama and Yoshimi shared similar interests like manga. However, one of her interests would be new to Toriyama, the love of Chinese culture. More on that later. The two felt a deep connection with one another and began dating. Since he was a child, Toriyama had stayed away from romance as he was shy around women, but he felt comfortable around Yoshimi. He's into efficient and assertive girls, as well as girls with short hair and glasses. Yoshimi was all these things. On top of that, he said she had a good personality and looked after his well-being. After about half a year of meeting, the two got engaged in October. The wedding was set in May the following year, but something amazing happened right before the marriage. Toriyama had been ranked the #1 wealthiest person in the other category in Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Overall, he ranked 35. He had a higher income than the wealthiest politicians, authors, singers, and actors. Reporters showed up at his home to ask for his comment, but thinking they were just neighbors, he asked if their visit was concerning his wedding. The ceremony was to be held at the Nagoya reception house and was meant to be low-key, as Toriyama was frugal and also not a fan of ostentatious things. But since he accidentally told the reporters about the wedding, they invited themselves. The couple did allow them to snap photos, but only if they did it within 5 minutes. Akira Toriyama and Yoshimi Kato married on May 2nd, 1982. After getting married, Yoshimi would end her career as a manga author in order to housekeep. But this wouldn't be the end of her influence in manga, as she would often help Toriyama meet deadlines on Dr. Slump, drawing backgrounds, and even help design future characters. She'd also introduce him to some of her art supplies, like Luma coloring ink, which is what he used going forward. Her appreciation of Chinese culture would also begin to rub off on Toriyama. Along with Slump, Toriyama would be asked to do other work, like creating one-shots for the Reader's Choice contest, which he was voted into by fans. For this contest, he'd be asked to produce a 45-page manga, which was a challenge since he was used to creating short chapters of about 13 to 15 pages. He came up with Pola and Royd, which took first place. After that came Escape, a 5-pager he created in 2 days and mimicked the style of North American comics. The following year, he'd be voted into the Reader Choice contest yet again, this time creating Mad Matic, inspired by Mad Max. Then Pink was created, which was a bit of a turning point, as now he had gotten more comfortable drawing female characters and decided to experiment with the character's girly side. One I often don't see brought up is Hitapi Manga Kenkyoju, where Toriyama teaches you the basics of creating manga. So if you want to become the next Akira Toriyama, maybe go pick yourself up a copy. Actually, he wrote this with a friend Akira Sakuma, whom he met through Torishima, I guess. Torishima said he met Sakuma when he was writing an article about Dr. Slump for Monthly Playboy, and I guess he also became friends with Akira Toriyama in the process. Sakuma helped Toriyama set up all kinds of interviews during these Dr. Slump days, one of which was a collaboration with Rumiko Takahashi, creator of Inuyasha. I think the collaboration was actually for this manga, but either way, it didn't work out. Also, I read one other thing. Apparently Sakuma arranged for Rumiko and Toriyama to get married, but that might just be a rumor, as Sakuma says he loves spreading lies. Anyway, he'll come up again shortly. This next one comes a bit later, but I'll mention it now. For the 3rd time in a row, Toriyama was entered into the Reader's Choice contest, though this time his manga was chosen to be the first published out of the 10 contestants. This forced him to work through New Year's to meet the deadline. He produced Chobit, inspired by American sitcom I Dream of Jeannie. This one did the worst out of his previous entries. Its lack of popularity upset him so much that he created Chobit 2, inspired by spaghetti western movies, which he was a big fan of. After getting married, Toriyama used those $2 million he earned, which reportedly became less than a quarter of that after taxes, to buy a plot of land in Kiyosu and build a home. Around this same time, in 1983, he'd found his manga production company Bird Studio in Nagoya. If you're wondering what his parents thought of his success, he says they didn't change much but did finally stop their complaining, although his father wanted them to buy a Mercedes-Benz at one point. Also around this time came the Akira Toriyama Preservation Fan Club. While initially an unofficial fan club, they'd get support from Shueisha and Toriyama himself, who even designed exclusive gifts for them. But more importantly, they got a bi-monthly newsletter called Birdland Press with covers designed by the man himself. There would be about 25 editions from 1982 to 1987, and the reason they're so important is due to their contents. There's many personal photos of Akira Toriyama and interviews exclusive to this newsletter. On top of that, issues 3, 4, 5, and 6 have his first two manga he ever made, Owawa World and Mysterious Rain Jack, which have never been fully released outside of these issues. These newsletters are very rare collector's items and to my knowledge haven't been fully documented yet. And just to add to the rarity, during an art exhibition tour in the 90s, the original manuscripts of Owawa World and Mysterious Rain Jack were stolen. These two manga may never officially see the light of day. By the end of 1982, Toriyama had been begging for Dr. Slump to end, so he and Torishima had a meeting with the vice editor-in-chief to discuss the matter. Torishima was late to the meeting, leading Toriyama to strike a deal that he could end Slump only if he'd start another manga that is more fun 3 months after. Both men got to work on ideas, but since Toriyama's schedule was still tight, he'd have to finish Dr. Slump chapters in 5 days instead of 7, which would open up 2 days for them to meet. Though they met several times, they couldn't come up with anything good. Torishima decided that they couldn't keep the schedule up, so he chose to meet one final time at Toriyama's house to definitively decide what the next story would be. But after a long day, no luck. As a defeated Torishima was almost ready to leave, Toriyama's wife Yoshimi brings them tea and starts to talk to Torishima about her husband's peculiarities. You see, he loved watching TV as he worked. Usually artists will listen to something less distracting like music, but Toriyama loved rewatching his favorite kung fu movies like Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, which he apparently watched 3 times a day for 10 days when it first released in theaters, and Jackie Chan movies, which he had been introduced to by his wife who was the biggest fan. Drunken Master was his favorite, and he told Torishima that he had seen it over 50 times already. Naturally, Torishima suggested he do a kung fu manga, but Toriyama was not keen on this idea. Yes, he loved kung fu movies, but there's a difference between enjoying something and wanting to work on that thing. Besides, he didn't think he could do fight scenes or write villains, since everything he's written up until this point had been relatively lighthearted. But Torishima would get his way and gave Toriyama a due date, which turned into Dragon Boy, a 2-part manga which follows a young martial artist named Tantan, which literally means China Boy. His journey centers around returning a bratty princess back to her homeland. He's clueless about the existence of women as he's been isolated from society all this time. He also has a pair of dragon wings, a master that flies on a cloud, and has a dragon jewel which produces a tiny dragon when imbued with ki. This manga clearly has Chinese inspiration and was definitely influenced by his wife. Dragon Boy went on to do exceptionally well with audiences. A couple months after, in November, The Adventures of Tongpu released and follows a boy who is sent to investigate alien planets. When his ship fails, he finds himself stranded on one of these planets where, much like Dragon Boy, finds a female companion. The two then devise a plan to steal her ship back from the alien who stole it. This manga features these small capsules that poof a vehicle or house into existence, and a familiar shot of this girl shooting our main character. These two manga would serve as a precursor for Toriyama's next big hit. Dr. Slump had a very Western feel, and Torishima wanted the next serial to be the exact opposite. So in January 1984, they started to plan Dr. Slump's end and began conceptualizing their new story. They decided on the more Chinese feel of Dragon Boy since it would be a good contrast to Dr. Slump and would help their new story stand out since China was a rather unique subject for manga at that time. Also, Yoshimi thought it fit the story, saying, "It wouldn't be too surprising if deep in the mountains of China they had guys who could levitate a bit off the ground." And Torishima reportedly thought of the brilliant idea of using the famous Chinese story Journey to the West as a reference, since 1, it was a free intellectual property, and 2, it had the elements needed for a long-form story, which was an issue they had with Dr. Slump and its weekly gags. But I can't confidently give Torishima all the credit. Reports on who came up with the Journey to the West idea vary. I mean, Yoshimi was the catalyst for all this Chinese inspiration, so she might have contributed to the idea. Somewhere in between working on concepts, in April, Toriyama and Yoshimi took a trip to China. Although not intended as research, the trip proved fruitful as he was able to study Chinese culture firsthand instead of through his wife's books. A couple months later in June, the clock starts ticking for Dr. Slump as its end date is finally set in August. Toriyama went all in with the Journey to the West influence and produced these initial character concepts. However, both his wife and Torishima thought these designs were too similar to the source material, with a literal monkey character, a literal pig with a rake, and a western looking girl. In order for young boys to latch onto the character, they needed to see themselves as the character, explained Toriyama. So it was back to the drawing board. Dr. Slump ended at this time, and their deadline for this new manga was fast approaching. In the next draft, the monkey became a human boy who he named Goku, and the girl became more urban and was named Pinchy. But there was an issue. The character Goku was too plain. He had no real distinguishing features. Toriyama liked how Tanton had wings and wanted to give Goku a feature like that. Toriyama suggested changing the hair and giving him a tail. Although Akira thought he was joking, he drew a tail on Goku, which was great. This way the reader could tell it was Goku even if his body was obscured. Other stuff would change in the final manuscript, like Pinchy, who was originally serious like her Journey to the West counterpart. She was written to be more vulgar, so her name changed to Bulma, or Bloomer, which are Japanese girl gym shorts. Along with characters, he needed story elements. Dragon Boy had this orb that summons a dragon. That story element got carried over in the form of 7 Dragon Balls. Why 7? Well, this was based off the Nanso Hakiden, a 19th century story about 8 dog warriors and their 8 crystal orbs, or something like that. But as to not be too derivative, it was changed to 7 for the story. This served as a fun game-like element for the boy audience, as well as an initial goal, with the manga possibly ending after a year once all 7 Dragon Balls were collected. With that being said, this serialization would be known as Dragon Ball and began its run 3 months after Dr. Slump on November 20th, 1984. This manga went through a lot of planning. However, the pen to paper creation was done last minute. 2 days before his deadline is when Toriyama started to work on the storyboard, beginning at midnight and finishing the storyboard at 6 AM, and then working on the final manuscript the next day and a half. It was pretty common practice of Toriyama to procrastinate, building his plastic models, playing games, and taking shortcuts wherever he could. Like instead of the standard practice of creating a rough draft, a detailed storyboard, and then the final product, Toriyama skipped the rough draft and went straight to the storyboard. He also never thought of the story ahead of time. Each week when fans would be waiting to see what would happen next, Toriyama was right there with them. Not even he knew where the story was going. This occasionally came with benefits, like being able to subvert fan expectations. Like one time, fans wrote in eager to see how Goku would win, but of course, Trolleyama would do the opposite. However, not planning ahead came with the occasional plot hole. Although he's been known to procrastinate, Toriyama says he's never been late during his serializations. A big reason is because Torishima threatened him with moving to Tokyo if he ever missed a deadline. There was one close call where Torishima had to go over to his home to watch over him. Toriyama really didn't like that pressure and said he probably would have quit if he had to be in those conditions in Tokyo. Dragon Ball was the series that essentially put Dr. Slump to rest, so it had big shoes to fill. But when it began its run, it didn't do great. Fans weren't latching onto this road manga. While Toriyama liked the Journey to the West story elements, something needed to change. Torishima thought Goku was too plain and claimed that was the reason for the unpopularity. This annoyed Toriyama as he deliberately made Goku plain to focus on movement and speed. Either way, he started thinking of how to make Dragon Ball more interesting. He thought back to Dr. Slump and how it had tournament-style events which did well with readers. He knew shonen readers liked action, so he tried his hand at changing the story to a tournament format. This is where Goku would receive his dogi, with a color meant to mimic those of Chinese monks. After the tournaments began, popularity rose, but it still wasn't quite at the level they hoped for. Of course, Dragon Ball needed an anime, which it got on February 26, 1986, taking over Dr. Slump's time slot. There were some concerns of the lovable Arale-chan being replaced, but those concerns were quickly swept away when Dragon Ball aired and did very well, scoring about a 27% in TV ratings. Toriyama's involvement with the anime side of things was pretty limited, as he was too busy creating the manga and thought he'd just leave it to the professionals as he knew nothing about animation. He was impressed with the staff's work, like how they animated Goku's hair when he moved his head, since his hairstyle was inconsistent. Although one thing about the anime that did upset him was the coloring of the gi and how it was red instead of orange as he envisioned. Akira was also tasked with choosing Goku's voice actor. He listened to about 5 or 6 audition tapes before choosing Masako Nozawa. And from that point on, her voice was the voice of Goku in his head as he drew the manga. He also specifically asked for actress Mayumi Tanaka after hearing her performance in Galactic Railroad. She'd voice Krillin. Alright, time to step away from Dragon Ball for a bit. So remember Akira Sakuma? Well, he heard that editor Torishima liked games, so he introduced him to a colleague of his named Yuji Horii, someone he knew from college and who was an old business partner. Yuji Horii had been venturing into game design, with one of his best works being a game he called Love Match Tennis. By the mid-80s, Toriyama got an idea to introduce gaming-related pages into Jump, so he reached out to Yuji for some help. One day, Toriyama was approached by an upcoming company named Enix. They wanted some help spreading the word on their gaming contest. Yuji was tasked to write about this contest, and seeing as how the prize money was 1 million yen, he decided to enter himself anonymously. He submitted Love Match Tennis, and it became one of the 13 games published by Enix in February 1983. His game went on to do well, which led Enix to ask him to create more. When the Nintendo Famicom released in 1983, it led to Toriyama and Yuji restructuring their Jump gaming column from PC games to Nintendo, and so the bi-monthly gaming section Famicom Shinken was born. While exploring ideas to spice up their gaming section, they decided to showcase the game development process. Yuji Horii would act as a bridge between Jump Magazine and Enix, creating the perfect opportunity for exclusive articles on game development. Yuji's next game was decided to be an RPG. Toriyama had been thinking of how they could marry Shonen Jump and video games, so he offered up the assistance of Akira Toriyama to create character designs for their new game, Dragon Quest. The game released May 27, 1986 and became one of the most important games in JRPG history. The series still continues to this day, with Akira Toriyama having served as the main character designer up until 2024. When designing for games, it did allow Toriyama to be more intricate with the characters, since he didn't have to draw them over and over as they wouldn't have to be animated. Toriyama became a bit of a gamer and became obsessed with the Dragon Quest series on Famicom, to the point where he couldn't get any work done and his wife had to step in to forbid him from playing any more games. Okay, back to Toriyama's life now. And as I've said at the beginning, we won't focus too much on the manga, but I did want to highlight some interesting stuff I found that lets us see the kind of guy Toriyama was. Around this time, he had his first child, Sasuke, born in 1987. When he was born, Toriyama had aspirations of being a strict and stern father, but he ended up being a big softie. He says that being a loving father did make him lose faith in himself. A year before Sasuke was born, Toriyama took in a stray black cat. He said it was raining out and he felt bad, so he let the cat in. It was cute and friendly, so he kept it and named it Koge. His second assistant, Takashi Matsuyama, who was hired based on his love of military model making, hated cats. He was always terrified when he came to work. And when Sasuke was born the next year, Koge got very jealous and fought for attention. The cat would have kittens, but there were birth complications and Toriyama and Yoshimi would have to help cut the umbilical cords and such. At the time of Dragon Ball, Toriyama had a dog named Mato, a female husky who was very playful and would push Sasuke around sometimes. But before either of those, there was Turbo. This dog's name inspired the name Turbo Senbei in Dr.Slump. Actually, I think he had Turbo and Turbo 2, and a cat named Ohiro? Anyways, more on his pets in a bit. So one might think that the master copies are precious to any artist or creator, but not to Toriyama. He'd say, I have no more interest in things that are finished. After Dr. Slump ended, the originals became piled up in Toriyama's garage, used by his son Sasuke as drawing paper. He's a guy who likes looking ahead, not focusing on the past. He's been scolded by his bosses telling him to store the copies properly, but he doesn't care. You know how Dragon Ball is full of perverted bits? Well, Toriyama has clarified that he was forced to do those thanks to his editor Torishima. I'd believe it, especially since he originally wanted to work at Playboy. But Toriyama has even called himself a pervert, so maybe he was just unjustly passing the blame onto his editor. There was one time a fan sent in a pair of panties and Toriyama hung them up until they got yellow with his cigarette smoke. Akira absolutely despises winter. He hates the cold, which is why in his manga it's usually warm and sunny. So we went over the Dragon Balls, but how about the Kamehameha wave? Initially, Toriyama didn't like the idea of naming techniques as it seemed silly in a battle of life and death. But Torishima insisted it'd be a good idea. As you know, Dragon Ball deals with ki energy, which can't be seen in real life. So he thought of how he'd portray ki as a fun way for boys to enjoy. He practiced a few poses while no one was looking and finally settled on the iconic pose. Now he needed a name. He said, I was wondering if there was a decent name along the lines of something something ha. His wife jokingly replied, Kamehameha would be fine, wouldn't it? This name was derived from a ruler of Hawaii, which interestingly translates to the very lonely one. With the exception of the Kamehameha, he named the rest of the techniques himself. As we gone over before, Toriyama did not like meeting people, which made him regret not using a pen name. He once joked about using the name Nikisaku Mizuta, which apparently translates to something like water-filled rice paddy, semi-annual crop. according to the Kanzenshuu translations. Early on, Toriyama would actually show his face from time to time in Jump, but one run-in with a fan made him regret everything. He said he walked into a supermarket and while walking past the fish department, an employee happened to recognize him. She demanded his autograph, and as much as he tried to defuse the situation, it seemed others overheard the commotion. And before he knew it, he was being swarmed by a crowd of ladies bringing him markers and papers. After incidents like these, he told them to stop printing his face. In June 1985, Akira visited Bali. He took their vacation photos to model the place where the Tenkaichi Budokai tournament was held. In future chapters, it was a challenge for him to reference his drawings of this recurring setting, as well as drawing the stands of all the people, so he'd often destroy the arena so he wouldn't have to keep drawing it. Toriyama notoriously hated drawing buildings and things that needed to be accurate, which is why characters fight a lot in wastelands, or why vehicles in Dragon Ball look so different than real life. Part of it is just his style, but it's easier to draw this fictional world since no one would get on him about accuracy. But even still, he would try to get things right, using his plastic models, which came in handy as references since you can turn them around 360. Speaking of plastic models, building them was his favorite hobby, much to his wife's dismay. He even had the honor to design some of his own through his assistant's friend's company, Fine Molds. Toriyama's second assistant, Takashi Matsuyama, similarly worked at a design agency and loved military model making. He regularly joined the Tamiya figure remodeling contest and won several prizes. Through a mutual connection, Matsuyama met Akira Toriyama, and both men happened to be a fan of each other's work. Toriyama recognized Matsuyama from the competitions, and Matsuyama loved Dr.Slump. When Akira's first assistant, Tanaka Hisashi, left in 1983, he went straight to Matsuyama, who quit his design job and relocated to be Toriyama's assistant. They bonded over their love of model making, among other things like motorbikes. Takashi Matsuyama would be the only assistant throughout Dragon Ball serialization. Akira Toriyama has reported that Kazuhiko Torishima was quite harsh on him, taking offense to him constantly shooting down his ideas, but it seems to be all in good fun, as they both had interviews together where they bicker about one another. Although Toriyama did complain about Torishima, he definitely respects him, as he's responsible for launching his career and for leading him on the road to success, as he thinks he wouldn't be successful if he were allowed to do whatever story he wanted. And likewise, Toriyama helped launch the career of Torishima, having a hit on his hands just 3 years after starting at the company, saying he probably would have been bullied otherwise since there was a toxic culture amongst editors which he didn't participate in. Alright, back to the main timeline a bit. So I said after the first tournament, the manga was still trying to gain traction. While they had action, now they needed a good villain. Since Toriyama was no good with villains, Torishima spent some weeks giving Toriyama a lesson on the most evil people in history. After about 10 people, they got to Roman Emperor Nero, who reveled in the suffering of others. This one struck a chord with Toriyama, and he created his first truly great villain, Demon King Piccolo, who was modeled after Torishima apparently. Piccolo went on to be Akira's favorite character. When the 23rd tournament came around, Goku's tail would go missing. This was due to Toriyama not wanting to deal with drawing it anymore and think about how his tail interacted with his pants. Goku also grew up, a change Torishima was adamantly against. You see, Dragon Ball had finally started to gain traction by this point, and having a radical change like this would upset audiences since this was not commonplace in manga. But Toriyama wanted to focus a lot more on battles, so Goku needed to grow since it was difficult drawing such a small character fighting larger enemies. He'd draw them a proof of concept and threatened to quit if he didn't get his way, so Torishima went to ask the editor-in-chief about the decision, to which he tepidly said it was fine. Whether or not either of them were okay with it didn't matter. Although he drew them a proof of concept, he actually drew the entire rough draft of the next chapter with adult Goku already in it. On the day the chapter released, Torishima came into the office early at 8 AM and sat by the phone to answer the hundreds of callers that would surely complain about the latest chapter. But in fact, no one called. Well, except for one adult, but besides them, everyone was okay with the sudden change. Torishima would stop being Toriyama's editor after this arc. His next editor would be Yu Kondo, who helped the series enter its next era of bigger battles. He also had the idea to appeal to female readers more with themes of family, love, and the handsome Prince Vegeta. In 1988, one individual would inspire a new style for Akira Toriyama. For the first time ever, Akira was working on an anime movie. Along with director Toyo Ashida, they worked closely together on Kosuke and Rikimaru. Toriyama took notice of the sharp lines and shading Ashida did. This would fundamentally change the art of Dragon Ball going forward. Around around the Frieza saga, he took a much sharper approach to lines, making everything more square. This made drawing faster and easier, but also helped to convey a sense of speed better. As far as coloring went, he adopted a segmented approach to shading, as opposed to blending everything as he had been before. Toriyama's style would continually change, of course. He's always changing drawing techniques to better suit the story. Throughout the years of stylistic changes, however, this drawing was continually his favorite, the only drawing that ever came out how he envisioned it in his mind. In April 1989, the Dragon Ball anime was being rebranded with a new series since the manga was taking a drastic turn with more violence. Toriyama also wanted a new producer, as Dragon Ball felt a bit too kid-friendly and this new anime needed a harder edge. He sought out Kozo Morishita and Takao Koyama, director and writer of the Saint Seiya anime, which was very popular despite its manga shortcomings. And of course, they needed a new name. Originally, they thought of naming it something like Dragon Ball The Wonder Boy, or Dragon Ball 2, or Dragon Ball 90. But the one name that was in serious consideration for a while was Dragon Ball Gohan's Great Adventure, since the anime staff thought Goku's son Gohan was going to become the central character. But Toriyama clarified, saying Goku would still be the lead, so the staff asked him to name the new show. He thought the whole thing was unnecessary, but suggested, wouldn't it be cool as just a Z? Since Z is the last character in the alphabet, and this was symbolic of the show covering the end of the manga. The staff was careful not to market the show as The End, as to not disappoint fans. During Dragon Ball, Toriyama was still destroying his sleeping schedule. He said his inking days are when his assistant Matsuyama comes to work and he stays there from about 1 PM to 9 PM. And Toriyama continues into the early morning until about 4 AM. Of course, this sometimes varies. I've read that Matsuyama would stay until about 2 AM some days. You know, people have often portrayed Toriyama as lazy, and he even calls himself lazy, but I don't think it's possible to call anyone in this profession lazy. Sure, he takes shortcuts and tries to work the least that he can, but just look at how much work it takes to get one chapter done. And to do that week after week for years takes serious dedication. Speaking of shortcuts, one of the most well-known is him making Goku's Super Saiyan transformation blonde so he wouldn't have to ink all the hair. But he actually did this for his assistant Matsuyama's benefit, who complained about having to ink Goku's black hair, which in a roundabout way also benefited Toriyama, I guess, since Matsuyama only came 1 day a week, and if he couldn't finish inking, then Toriyama had to do the rest himself. While on the topic of the Frieza saga, there was one animator at Toei that Toriyama trusted the most, Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru. His style was almost indistinguishable from Toriyama's, and he'd be responsible for creating the character Bardock. As I've said, Toriyama wasn't involved with the anime, but sometimes they'd ask him to create anime exclusive characters, like Gregory or several of the movie characters. But in this case, Nakatsuru was the one to come up with the original Bardock design, with revisions from Toriyama. When Akira saw the special, he was moved by it and decided to put Bardock in a couple of panels in the manga. Nakatsuru was very shocked to see this when he got the storyboards for the next manga chapter. All this talk of the anime and Toriyama not being involved might have you wondering if he watched the show at all. Well, the Bardock special was his favorite, but aside from that, I found some conflicting reports. In one interview, he says he's too shy and embarrassed to watch his own work, so he was never able to muster the courage to sit and watch. Rather, he just turned the channel to Fuji TV and only sneak glances. In other interviews, he said he does watch it while eating and is intrigued to see how they'll handle certain scenes, and even recorded some of the episodes. I think he puts it on in the background while doing other stuff, but doesn't watch too closely. As far as the theatrical films go, he avoided going to the theaters to watch them for fear of being discovered by fans. As a kid, Toriyama had 2 lumps on his head removed. While he doesn't remember this, the scars are still there. And as an adult, he had a lump of fat removed from his left butt cheek after it became swollen. The doctor didn't use any anesthesia, and it was so painful he thought he was gonna die. He actually had a total of 3 lumps and got the other 2 removed weeks later. And for a month, he had to work leaning solely on his right butt cheek. He said it was hell. In October 1990, his second child, Kika, was born. He thought for sure he'd be strict this time, but knew he couldn't be strict to a girl. And then he came to realize, what's wrong with doting on your kids? By the time the next saga came around, Toriyama expressed feeling tired, having been doing manga for around 13 years with almost no breaks. He said, "It's gotten to be tough on me, both physically and mentally. I was never the type who naturally has a lot of willpower after all. So for the sake of both myself and my family, I'm starting to think it's about time I work on something more slowly and carefully." Although Torishima hadn't been Toriyama's editor anymore, he did call up Toriyama to let his dissatisfaction be known with the artificial human villains. "Hey, it's just a fatso and some old guy," said Torishima, which led to Android 17 and 18 being created. "What? This time it's just some brats?" which finally led to Cell. His actual editor, Yu Kondo, thought Cell looked ugly and wanted him to look cooler, leading to his second form, which was Toriyama's favorite since he had a mouth and was more expressive. Though Kondo said he looked like a moron and told Toriyama to turn him into his perfect form already. He obliged and Cell's perfect form was born. Yu Kondo was finally satisfied, but he'd also leave around this time before the Cell Saga even finished, making Fuyuto Takeda the third and final editor for Dragon Ball. At this point, I'd like to say that all three of Toriyama's editors during these early days had one thing in common. They all had villains based off of them. Torishima got a double whammy with Dr. Mascherito and Dr. Slump, who was Senbei Noramaki's rival. Toriyama was told to think of who he hated the most, so he drew Torishima. He even calls Torishima Mascherito as a nickname. And of course, he also got Demon King Piccolo, as we went over earlier. Yu Kondo would be the model for Frieza, and finally, Fuyuto Takeda was the model for Majin Buu, the final villain for Dragon Ball. Takeda had one scary experience working with Toriyama. As you know, he would mail in his manuscripts. Well, one time the delivery truck carrying the manuscript got into an accident. In a panic, Takeda called Toriyama, who thankfully had photocopies. Around this time, towards the end of Dragon Ball in 1993, Toriyama helped build an arcade cabinet sporting his iconic robotic design. This was meant to debut later at Jump's 25th anniversary event in the summer. As excited as Toriyama was to play it, he'd have to wait. Going into the next saga of Dragon Ball, Toriyama thought there was no way for Goku or the villains to get stronger. So he said, "This is the end, so I'm going to draw whatever I want." So he let loose with a lot of gags and jokes. Fusion would come to be when Toriyama told his close friend Masakazu Katsura, whom he met while they were both under the rule of Torishima, "There's nothing stronger than a Super Saiyan." To which Masakazu said, "There's no choice but for them to fuse." The fusion dance was a good example of Toriyama having fun. He actually had to practice the pose himself to get the amount of steps correct. His kids also had a blast practicing the pose, just like we all did. As far as Potara earrings are concerned, Toriyama got really lucky there. A new film was in the works that showcased Goku and Vegeta fusing via the dance, so he wanted to do something different for the manga. He noticed he'd been using earrings on Kaioshin and turned them into a plot point when they were initially just decoration. Another beautiful example of him being a discovery writer. All good things must come to an end, and the original Dragon Ball manga concluded on May 23rd, 1995. While thinking of a definitive ending, Toriyama jumped 10 years into the future to really tell audiences this was the end. Sadly, just before the end of the manga, in March his dog Mato, who had been with them for 10 years, passed away from kidney problems. Toriyama and Yoshimi took her to the vet regularly for half a year and then every day for the last month, but it was no use. Toriyama said it was really rough to make deadlines those last few chapters. But thankfully, Mato was survived by 2 puppies. She had babies in 91 and they stayed with Toriyama's sister Uzura. After waiting what he felt was a respectable time, Toriyama went to go get another dog. This time, a Pembroke Welsh Corgi, who he jokingly named Toma, a reverse of Mato's syllables. A Corgi was actually the dog Toriyama wanted all those years ago, but the pet store showed him the husky and he fell in love with the uncommon breed. He's also had fish, turtles, geckos, newts, bunnies, and his son got a hamster despite Toriyama's distaste for rodents. They also got these 2 cats that were better for Kika's allergies. We'll discuss one of them later. The same year Dragon Ball ended, another very important game released with Toriyama's designs. Chrono Trigger released on the Super Famicom in March 1995, and this time it was published by Square. The game once again had involvement and input from Yuji Horii and Kazuhiko Torishima, but this time he worked with 2 other important people, that being Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi and Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu, both of which I discussed in my last video. Go watch that if you'd like to know more about Final Fantasy music. The reason I bring these 2 up is because Akira Toriyama would later work with them on games like Blue Dragon and Fantasian from Studio Mistwalker, the game studio Hironobu Sakaguchi created after leaving Square Enix. Outside of RPGs, Toriyama worked on fighting games like Tobo 1 and 2, among others. When Dragon Ball ended, Toriyama was thrilled. He was over serializations and wanted more time to himself. He spent a lot more time playing with his kids and riding his motorbike, one of which Jump gifted him for his 500th Dragon Ball chapter. He also vacationed with his family to places like Tokyo Disneyland, where he'd take his sister and her kids, and Guam because it was nice and warm just how he liked it. And surprisingly, he went out to visit friends occasionally, like Masakazu Katsura, the guy who gave him the idea of fusion. They'd play games at each other's houses like Tekken, which Toriyama was bad at, and Super Donkey Kong. On one occasion, the two of them would go visit illustrator Katsuya Terada, and then all three of them went to the home of sculptor Takayuki Takeya, whose work Toriyama admired. While it's true he wasn't a people person, meeting up with other creatives was stimulating for Toriyama. There's pretty limited info on him after Dragon Ball, as now he was able to lay low, away from the spotlight. The man was just enjoying life, and that's all there really is to it. Former editor Torishima had been working on V-Jump magazine, which he started in the early 90s, a magazine focused on manga and video games. He'd be called back to work for Shonen Jump as editor-in-chief. The reason is that they wanted Toriyama back to create another series, as sales were significantly down after Dragon Ball, though not necessarily because Dragon Ball ended, but rather Japan was in an economic collapse at this time. Torishima became editor-in-chief in 1996, but he knew Toriyama wouldn't want to come back, at least not in the same way. He knew how much he struggled back then to keep up, losing all his hair in the process. From this point on, Toriyama never did another serialization, mostly just one-shots. I'll put those on screen now, we'll discuss only a few of them later. The people at Toei also weren't ready for Dragon Ball Z to end, so they took matters into their own hands and continued it themselves with Dragon Ball GT, a title Toriyama also came up with, which means Grand Tour or touring. While he didn't work on the show, he did help with some initial designs. He was excited that someone else was taking care of the work and he could just sit back and enjoy it like everyone else. Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru, Toriyama's trusted animator, took care of the Super Saiyan 4 design. While not his design, Toriyama would draw this picture of Super Saiyan 4 Goku. After Dragon Ball, a few notable names were asked for their comment on the manga, creators of Bleach, Naruto, and One Piece. They're all similar ages and all grew up loving Dragon Ball, having fond memories of it as kids. It's what everyone was talking about those days, even the teachers. There were even unwritten rules and punishments for those who dared spoil that week's chapter. This next generation were all inspired by Dragon Ball, and who knows if we would have gotten Bleach, Naruto, or One Piece had Toriyama not decided to pick up a pen and draw for that prize money. The world of manga and anime would have been very different today. And as if the praise of those three weren't enough, even the creator of Astro Boy, Osamu Tezuka, often referred to as the father of anime or the god of manga, etc., claimed Toriyama as his successor. He passed away in 1989 before Dragon Ball ended its run. By the way, if you're wondering what his kids thought of Dragon Ball, well, they had a mixed relationship with it. His son Sasuke eventually came around to it and would even go watch the films in theaters. But his daughter Kika, on the other hand, hated it and had no interest in watching it. Sometime in 1996, toy company Bandai gifted a Macintosh computer to Akira Toriyama. They showed him how to use it and he was very grateful for the present. While others thought computer art flavorless, he said that the computer saved his career as he'd grown tired of illustration by this point. He said, "If not for the PC, I think I might have completely lost interest in drawing." In the beginning, he mostly used it for coloring, as dealing with prepping and cleaning his coloring supplies was very cumbersome. The first of his manga to start having digital work would be the cover of Toki Mecha in 1997. He only digitally drew for standalone illustrations, but still hand drew his manga. The computer was a real space saver, which was good considering his office space was so cramped with model kits, magazines, airguns, and more. The work didn't necessarily speed up, but now he got to work completely sitting down, which was enjoyable for him. Although he's made millions, Akira Toriyama was pretty frugal. He says maybe it's because of how far he's come, but he doesn't really want anything. Although that hasn't really stopped him from buying stuff, like a customized Jaguar Mark II classic car that he meticulously designed the color of. Even as an adult, he still had that habit of drawing things he wanted hundreds of times. Like during Dr.Slump, he wanted a motorbike. He does this as a sort of way to ask his wife's permission to buy something, as he doesn't want to make the financial decision himself and needs encouragement. At the turn of the century, the short series of Neko Majin began, which transitioned into Neko Majin Z in 2001. This marked the return of some of our favorite Dragon Ball characters. And the year 2000 saw Sandland, which got an anime adaptation over 2 decades later. This manga is also significant as almost ending Toriyama's drawing career. Sorta. It had nothing to do with the manga itself, rather once he finished drawing and coloring, he seemed to have misplaced his pen. the wooden pen holder he bought at 14 and had used throughout Dr. Slump, Dragon Ball, and beyond. He used others, but it just wasn't the same. He'd use this as a half-hearted excuse to stop drawing. Actually, this was a common occurrence since his room was so cluttered. While he reported losing his pen, he did find it again, as he shows it here in this 2008 magazine. But after Sandland, his production of manga did actually go down, mostly opting for collaborations and small contributions to other manga. However, one interesting thing he did work on after Sandland was a children's book. He thought of his children while creating the book, but production took so long that by the time he finished in 2003, they were already in junior high and high school and weren't children anymore. Toriyama went to New York for the launch of Shonen Jump in America in 2002. It was here where a man approached him and asked who he'd like to see play Goku in their live-action Dragon Ball production, Dragon Ball Evolution. Yes, as early as 2002, Toriyama said the studio had been planning the eventual film. Apparently they wanted to read the manga or something. Anyway, what was his response? He said he had no idea, but later said if they had made a live-action movie back in the day, it would 100% have to be Jackie Chan. There was no one else it could be. Masako Nozawa, the voice of Goku, said she'd like to be in the movie as a cameo. I'd want to see Goku just as he fires his Kamehameha and say, "Even I can do that," then walk away, said Nozawa. On the other hand, Toriyama expressed no interest as he thought showing up in your own work was the worst. Even though he did self-insert, but he probably meant in real life. If he had to be in the movie, however, he said he'd like to be a Budokai spectator. Before the movie released, he did have this to say. Well, I am happy, but I'm not overly fond of watching my own works. As long as it doesn't get too extreme, I have no intention of opening my mouth about the contents of the script or anything. I have no particular request with regards to the cast either. These would be words that he would come to regret. We'll touch on Evolution a bit later. When the Dragon Ball manga was getting re-released in 2002, Toriyama had to design each volume's cover. He needed to refresh his memory on the story, so he got to reading his own manga for the first time ever. He was quite impressed with his own work. In 2008, he did a collab with his good friend Masakazu Katsura on Sachi-chan Good. Toriyama thought of the story and Masakazu drew. This was quite the experience for them, working on a one-shot with a close friend. They said they bickered a lot during the process. Masakazu's bosses told him he should do another collab just like that one, so he teamed up again with Toriyama on Gia. That same year, Dragon Ball made a small return with the short film Yo Son Goku and His Friends Return. This one was particularly special as it was really the first time Akira Toriyama was involved with developing the main story, rather than just signing off on it like before. A couple other specials would be released shortly after, but something bigger than we could have imagined was on the horizon. Dragon Ball Evolution. This live-action masterpiece released in 2009, it's often regarded as the worst live-action adaptation. But what did the man himself have to say on the film? Well, we went over how he had no intention of giving advice, but once he learned of their creative decisions, he tried stepping in. Sadly, his words would fall on deaf ears. He reported, "The script had too little of a grasp on the world and its characteristics, and on top of that, it had a conventional content that I couldn't find interesting. So I cautioned them and suggested changes, but in spite of that, they seemed to have a strange confidence and didn't really listen to me. What came out in the end was a movie I couldn't really call a Dragon Ball that lived up to my expectations." Toriyama even investigated the legality of 20th Century Fox ignoring Shueisha, and basically Shueisha would have had to pay $45 million if they wanted to have more direct control, which was about 60 to 70% of their yearly profits according to Toriyama. By the way, if you want to see a good live-action Dragon Ball movie, then give me a second to shout out Dragon Ball The Magic Begins. This is a weird unofficial Taiwanese Dragon Ball movie that I strangely found one night scrolling the bottom of HBO Max. It's kind of one of those it's so bad it's good kind of movies, but it's surprisingly faithful to Dragon Ball, most of the time anyway. As bad as Dragon Ball Evolution was, this would actually be a blessing in disguise. Following the disastrous Hollywood movie, the next animated feature film was in production at Toei in 2011. While in Tokyo, Toriyama handed Toriyama the movie's script. This was the first time Toriyama even heard of the film's production, and having suffered the humiliation of Dragon Ball Evolution, he was energized more than ever to be involved with this new theatrical release. Although he thought he was over Dragon Ball, he came to realize just how important it really was to him. After reading the script, he thought the plot was too dark. The original script had something about characters being taken over with evil hearts. This was following the tragic 2011 tsunami in Japan, and Toriyama wanted something more uplifting. He told director Masahiro Hosoda that he didn't want any citywide panic or destruction. Toriyama was, however, a fan of this God of Destruction idea, but the story and characters needed work, so he got down to rewriting pretty much everything, to the point where they had to cut down his original script. This would be the first time he worked this deeply on any of the animations. He redesigned Goku's new transformation, Super Saiyan God, that was originally designed by Tadayoshi Yamamuro as muscular and caped. Toriyama opted for a much more slim and simple approach. Yamamuro defended his own design but was shot down by Toriyama, which came as a surprise since he usually just signed off on things, but he was clearly getting more serious now. The God of Destruction was originally a sinister lizard character, but just like with Super Saiyan God, was redesigned by Toriyama as his Cornish Rex cat, who was interestingly diagnosed with a fatal illness, given a short time to live. But when it survived, the vet said it had to be a demon. Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods released in 2013, making it the first theatrical release for Dragon Ball in 17 years. This also ushered in the next era of Dragon Ball, and we can all thank Dragon Ball Evolution for upsetting Toriyama and giving him the motivation to work on the film. Shortly after Battle of Gods, Toriyama released his final manga, Jacko the Galactic Patrolman. This had been in development alongside Battle of Gods and is even set in the Dragon Ball universe, having a bonus Dragon Ball prequel chapter at the end. Jacko was meant to be released with Battle of Gods, but Toriyama fell behind 4 months on schedule. Being in his old age meant he'd have more trouble working absurdly long hours like he used to back in the day. Even still, he'd wreck his body, working on just 2 hours of sleep to finish the manga. Jacko the Galactic Patrolman was all digital. This was the last manga he'd do completely by himself, and he says it's some of his favorite work as he enjoys these smaller stories as opposed to the big flashy ones. Jacko is also apparently his favorite character that he's created, so obviously he needed to be in the next big Dragon Ball event. Back in 2008, a band by the name Maximum the Hormone wrote the song F, which was a song about Frieza from Dragon Ball. Toriyama had been introduced to this song by a friend, and in October 2012, he attended one of their concerts with his daughter, where he'd meet the band backstage to surprise them with some drawings. He'd been struggling to think of what to do for the next movie, and this song would inspire him to bring back Frieza for Dragon Ball Z Resurrection F. This film introduced yet another form for Goku as well as a new form for Frieza. Unlike Battle of Gods, this installment saw a lot less involvement from Toriyama. He explained it like this: "It's really embarrassing to have this called a screenplay. It'd probably be more accurate to say it's just a memo. It's simply something I idly dashed off for the staff just to help explain the flow of the story and the dialogue." I have seen some discourse around how much he was actually involved, but it's safe to say that it was a step back from Battle of Gods. And with that, we finally move on to Dragon Ball Super, the next anime in the franchise, which began in 2015. Yet again, Toriyama didn't have too much involvement here. He wrote the story for the Universe 6 arc and designed some of the characters. This was basically the relationship for the anime, just sort of advising the story and designing characters. Once Dragon Ball Super was over, it would get a manga, but before we talk about that, we need to discuss the interesting story of Toriyama's successor. So as far as I understand the story, back in May 1999, Spain magazine Hobby Consolas published this drawing of Super Saiyan 5 Goku for a rumored upcoming series, Dragon Ball AF. This drawing was credited to someone named David Montiel Franco, also known as Tablos. Obviously, we all now know it was a hoax. But due to the image's popularity, a Japanese fan by the pen name Toibo created a real AF manga in 2006. Toibo's talents would be recognized by Shueisha, and he'd get brought on board in 2012 under the new name Toyotaro. In 2013, Toyotaro stopped the Dragon Ball AF manga, leaving this goodbye message that says he plans to return to it someday. He'd go on to draw Dragon Ball Heroes Victory Mission, then adapt the Resurrection F manga. After that, he'd expressed interest in drawing the Dragon Ball Super manga. He'd be asked to draw 2 pages of Super and did so with great accuracy. And that's how Toriyama came to choose him as his successor. Toriyama writes the basic plot points and Toyotaro comes up with the rest of the story and illustrations. He'll send it to his editor Victory Ochida and Toriyama will sign off on the work. In spring 2017, Toriyama was presented with a few ideas for the next movie, this time a Dragon Ball Super movie. After some months via email, Toriyama collected their ideas and created Dragon Ball Super Broly. The script was ready in May, and Toriyama helped design a lot of the characters, vehicles, and settings. One of the most notable things about this movie was the style. An audition would be held among staff for the position of animation director. Several things were judged by Toriyama, like how cool they could draw characters in a normal front-facing standing pose, and if the artist understood the posture of the body with a gi. Naohiro Shintani would ultimately be chosen, someone who was new to Dragon Ball, never having worked on the anime before, except for some key animation in Yosan Goku. His style gave us visuals that were closer to the manga than ever before. The next film would sadly be Toriyama's last to work on, Dragon Ball Super Superhero. Just like the last movie, this film's visuals were drastically different, opting for mostly CGI. Toriyama's involvement here would honestly be pretty similar as before, writing the overall story and helping with character designs. But his involvement here was reportedly more than the previous 3 movies. The name Dragon Ball Super Superhero is oddly repetitive. Toriyama has stated that this was because he forgot that this new series was already called Dragon Ball Super, but no one on staff corrected him, thinking it was intentional. The movie was slightly delayed due to a cyber attack at Toei, but released only a couple months behind schedule. In fall 2023, Takashi Matsuyama, Toriyama's second assistant who worked with him all throughout Dragon Ball, was having a wedding. He and Toriyama had a very positive experience working together and kept in touch all these years later. They even worked on this one shot together back in 2009. Anyway, Matsuyama asked Toriyama to be a witness at the wedding, a request he gladly accepted. At the wedding, he'd tell Matsuyama he was to have brain surgery come the new year. He'd say, "It's on the outside, so it's not such a big deal." Matsuyama recalls Toriyama trying to quit smoking, but at this stage in his life, it was kind of late. Toriyama is said to have smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day in his youth. Later that same year in December, Toriyama won the Lifetime Achievement Award with the 2024 Tokyo Anime Award Festival. He was set to receive this award on stage at the festival, which ran from March 8 to 11. This was rather special since he rarely makes public appearances. He prepared a statement where he highlighted how he didn't watch his own work when it was being animated due to him being shy. He also went over his work on Battle of Gods and how embarrassing it was for him to win this award, presumably because he had little involvement with the anime side of things. Animator Toyo Ashida, who we went over earlier, is mentioned as being a big influence on his work, giving the manga the sense of speed it needed. The last part of his award statement sadly ended with this: "Perhaps because of my lifestyle when I was younger, I have no real confidence in my health, and I don't know how much more I'll be able to do. But I'll do my best, aiming to make even more enjoyable work, so please keep supporting me from here on out." Unfortunately, his presumptions were correct. A week before accepting his award, on March 1st, 2024, the year of the dragon, the man that touched the lives of so many young artists, readers, and anime fans, passed away from acute subdural hematoma, a collection of blood in the brain usually caused by a head injury. His death would later be made public to the world on March 7th by his company Bird Studio. Toyotaro later shared that Toriyama's final correction to the manga was this touching image of his favorite character Piccolo waving goodbye. And with that, that wraps up the life of the legendary Akira Toriyama. While he may not be the best-selling manga artist, the impact on pop culture he's had is unmatched. Dragon Ball is almost a second universal language. It's something that brings people together unlike anything else. While he may be gone, there is one final surprise for us. Dragon Ball Daima, a new anime which was originally not meant to have any input from Toriyama. But as he started to give the staff advice, things got out of hand, and like with Battle of Gods, he became heavily involved with the story and designs. Daima is set to air later in 2024, and even as that comes and goes, Akira Toriyama's legacy will continue to live on through countless artists and creators who have been influenced by his work, and by us, the fans, who continue to celebrate everything he's given us. We're all gonna miss you, man. Thank you, and farewell. Wow, what a long video. Would you believe that was only half the research I did? This video could have easily been 2 hours, but I had to really pick and choose the most important stuff. If you made it this far, then please consider liking the video and subscribe if you're interested in learning about the lives of your favorite artists and creators. I really love Dragon Ball, so of course I had to do Akira Toriyama. I had actually planned this video for later in the year, but with his recent passing, I decided to do it now. Let me know if I missed anything or if I got anything wrong. I love learning this kind of stuff, so if you know something that I don't, then I'd appreciate it. Alright everyone, remember to stay cultured and I'll see you all next time.